Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones. The unvisited ones. The cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, I am very pleased to welcome back to the show one of my favourite guests from last year, Diana Walsh Pasulka. Dr. Pasulka is chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religion at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. She returns today to talk about her latest book, American Cosmic. Diana, welcome back.
Well, thank you for having me back. This is great. I enjoy talking with you.
Oh, absolutely. The feeling is very mutual. And last time we spoke about the upcoming book and a bunch of other stuff like, saints and things, adventures in the Vatican and all this kind of stuff. But the book is out now. And
it is.
And obviously I've read it. And really interesting. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but it's almost like a road novel or something.
Yeah, it is.
And I mean, talk us through that to start with, because it's like, how do you tell a story like this when you actually can't tell all of it because of the nature of the actual content? So was a lot of thinking around, well, how do I tell this? How do I tell the story of academics, but not in an academic way, of things I can and can't say? Was that something of a challenge?
It was a huge challenge. And in fact, it takes me through mood swings, really. So the book was, like I think I said last time, the book in a sense, at some point, wrote itself. And I just basically had to follow it and keep up with it because it was going in this direction that an academic book doesn't go in, right? And so, but I had to respect that this was the direction it was going. And I knew that it was important to tell the stories of the people in the book because they're invisible stories. And most people don't know about these types of communities. And so I needed to tell about those types of communities without hurting anybody in the communities, right? And, so I had to be really careful. I had several editors of the book. And so I felt comfortable because everybody in the book read their part and they said, okay, and it passed their muster, right? So they were able to say, okay, I'm comfortable with you saying this about me. And of course, two people in the book are, they're not named, they have pseudonyms. And so it was a struggle in methodologically as an academic to say and I came out right in the, first chapter, basically saying this is a clash of cultures here. We've got what looks to be intelligent cultures and that's nothing new, by the way, with respect to religion. And that's something that people don't actually understand is that, religions are spun. And a lot of times they're spun by powerful communities. And a lot of those communities could, intersect with intelligence communities. So in that sense, I was involved with people whose stories had to be told in special ways, and I had to respect that, or just not tell the story. But I thought it was such an important story to tell that I dove in and I questioned myself in the introduction. I said, how do I tell the story under the kinds of rules I've been given as, an academic? And I said, I don't know, so I'm just going to do it. And I did. And it was, peer reviewed and reviewed by my editor at Oxford. And now that I'm doing interviews for the book, what I do, I've had to develop this, was, there's my opinion, and then there's what I can say. I'm not a representative of either the Catholic Church or any American intelligence community, right? And I'm not I am not, if I'm talking off the record, I'm not representing Oxford University Press either. So, so I've got to make sure, there's obviously the book is published by Oxford, so that's anything in the book is fine and kosher. But there are different ways that I can approach questions from people, who ask me things that go off the Oxford path or go off the university path, and that type of thing.
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, it's a mood swingy thing. I still have anxiety about it, in fact.
Well, it's funny the way you were describing it. Then it's your background isn't anthropology, but it's very anthropological because, particularly if you are a field anthropologist and you're embedded in cultures or societies that have initiatory customs that you have some either full or limited exposure to, and then how you convey or share that information in a printed context outside culture and what you can and can't say. And it just your process there of running it past all the people who are mentioned in the book, even pseudonymously, I'm getting that wrong, you know what I mean, who have pseudonyms.
Yes.
Yes. That's very anthropological. Like that's sort of best practice if you are trying to explore, a Dogon tribe's spirit group or something.
And I'm incredibly, most of the people that I read are anthropologists, like Tanya Luhrmann, and I spoke a lot about the book, and she gave me a lot of feedback. She even blurbed the book. So, she's an anthropologist at Stanford, and I admire her methodology and her work. And she's worked in communities of people who are, believe in God and, like evangelical Christian communities and things like that. And she even met Tyler in the book. So, and she interviewed him. So, so she's a mentor in the sense that I've read all of her books. She's written some really cool books. Yeah. And so, so you're right on the spot there. That's true. Religious studies is a field that's really interdisciplinary. So I'm able to do what I can,
Yeah, true. We spoke a little bit, because obviously I hadn't read it last time you were on the show, about the synchronicities and adventures that accompany the writing of the book, right? So that's all cool, and I'll make sure that's in the show notes. But in it, Scott Brown observed, and I like this, maybe we'll pick up on it a bit later as well, that if you're not experiencing synchronicities, whatever they happen to be, while doing this sort of research, then you probably aren't doing it right. Now, so I guess we spoke a bit about that during the process of writing the book, but now that it's out, how have the syncs been since the book came out?
Okay, so it's really funny because it was David Stinnett, I think, who works with Scott Brown, said that.
Oh, right,
he's got a very specific, he's interesting in the sense that the synchronicities and coincidences, meaningful coincidences, could drive a person crazy if that person accepts, the materialist view of reality. And, but I think that for a lot of people who are, like I said on your last show, that synchronicity is the engine of religion. So if you go into any kind of community that's religious, even New Age communities or and there are these, they talk about synchronicity will show you the way or something like that. So Nietzsche actually talked about that, Friedrich Nietzsche, a long time ago. And I discussed the synchronicity I had with his book.
I love that one.
Science, it was a really weird synchronicity that, included Catholic saints and everything.
Well, it was funny. I just want to jump in there because I laughed out loud at that, thinking if I didn't love Diana before, you open with, it was New Year's Eve, so I went to bed. And I'm like, boom, that's exactly what you do on New Year's Eve. I'm like, damn right, it's New Year's Eve. I was in bed. Yeah.
It's true. I know. And, I was young, so I should have been out reveling, but I wasn't. That's the kind of person I was. And I guess still am. So when Christmas Eve hit, when New Year's Eve hit 12, right? And so everybody's out there screaming and doing the things that they do. I wake up and there's that book, The Gay Science, at my bedside. I hadn't read it because I actually didn't like Nietzsche at the time. And so I picked it up and there I randomly opened to a page And it's a book of aphorisms, and it's an aphorism about New Year's Eve. And it's also about Saint Januarius, right? Whose blood is desiccated. His blood is like, doesn't, it's in this church in, I believe it's France. I'm not entirely sure. And so every New Year's, his blood actually turns liquid again. And so this was, and I thought, wow, that's a really weird synchronicity. And I didn't even call it a synchronicity then because, my mind frame wasn't there. And so I thought, this is really odd. And he said, he had it was a very powerful aphorism. And so I turned the page because I was so fascinated now all of a sudden by this book by Nietzsche. I turned the page and he basically had this incredibly poignant, beautiful passage on why you should not believe in synchronicities. And I was like, what? And so from then on, I was captivated by him. And I've now heard from many, many, many people who have had Nietzsche synchronicities. I think there could be a whole book on people who've had synchronicities with Nietzsche's work. And, what a cool book that would be. Somebody needs to write that. So, yeah. So
sorry to interrupt. Are people telling you that about yours? Because I've got one for yours. That's the thing. That's sort of where I was going. Have you you yourself had syncs now that the book is an object in the world? And are people going like, I read this book? So let's talk about some of them, because mine's it's the usual thing. It's like when you tell people, because so much of a synchronicity is an inner experience, you tell people and it doesn't sound that weird or impressive, but like, in the experience of it is. But I'd just be kind of keen to hear if you yourself have had them now that the book is out in the world, specifically relating to your book, or any other fun ones you'd like to kind of share. Because again, if you do this kind of research, it should kind of come with the territory, right? It
does. So I was on, what's it called? Shattered Reality. And the person who was interviewing me told me that she had the book. No one actually expects the book to be like it is. And I agree. I didn't expect it to be that way either. I told Tyler when I was writing it, I said, this is just going to be another kind of dry academic book, right? And so no one expects it when they pick it up for it to like be this kind of, like you said, like this road trip book, right? And so she said that she expected it to be this dry academic book. It certainly looks like when you pick it up and you read the blurbs and stuff, except for perhaps the Chad and Carrie Hayes blurb. And so she's on a plane and she's going to the Vatican, and she's going to Rome to the Vatican, but she doesn't know that I talk about that in the book. And so she randomly opens a page where I talk about where I'm on the plane. And she says, as she randomly opens up and she's on the plane to Rome and she's reading about me on the plane to Rome, she then thinks that she sees this figure, this dark figure out of the corner of her eye that's like almost like a ghost in the airplane. And so she has this, coincidence, and people have told me all kinds of different coincidences that they've had. A lot of them having to do, strangely enough, and ironically enough, and absurdly enough, with Fight Club. So I had a series of very strange Fight Club synchronicities. And then once it got out, a lot of people, when I was on social media, I did actually have to go off social media for a while. I will get on again, but I did have to go off. We could talk about that as well at some point. But so a lot of people wrote to me on Twitter and on Facebook about their synchronicities with Fight Club. So Fight Club is a movie in that I think it's a 1999 movie, and it's about a very subversive group of people and this man who starts this group of men who fight each other. And so this man encounters Brad Pitt's character, and he's just he's someone who doesn't exist. He's just too incredibly amazing to exist, right? And so I thought, I was trying to understand how to convey this man, Tyler, who I write about in the first chapter and throughout the book. How do I convey this guy's character? I mean, this man is someone who I've never met a man like this before. He's so incredibly from the movies. He's so incredibly from science fiction that what could I possibly call him? So I thought at first that I'd call him like, David, as in like David Bowie or something like that. But that just did not fit the guy's personality. And so finally what hit me was, he is invisible. And he does do these things. He was, a fighter, and he does, so I called him Tyler, as in Tyler Durden from the movie Fight Club. And then when I called him that, and I had actually sent him the draft, the first draft, so he could okay it, he couldn't believe it, because he took pictures. He took pictures of the purple robe that Tyler Durden wears in the movie Fight Club. He actually found a robe that was purple and looked just like it. It's his favorite movie. And he also had soap. I mean, he had everything from Fight Club. And he said he literally cried when he read it, because he thought that he had been understood.
Oh, that's
so
nice.
I thought that was really odd, but it didn't stop there. So not only was it his favorite movie, and he actually had the purple robe from Fight Club and kind of fancied himself Tyler Durden, right? Scott Brown has, when I talked to Scott Brown and wrote chapter 3, I think it was, I told him, I said, listen, this book is not going to be a normal academic book. I'm actually going to frame it through like Fight Club. And he looked at me, and he had this look on his face, and he said, I've seen that movie. He goes, guess how many times I've seen that movie? And I said, oh, I don't know, like, 6. And he goes, higher. And I said, oh, gosh, like 15? And he said, higher. He had seen the movie 150 times. So it was really weird.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, well, mine isn't as impressive as the Rome plane one, I think, but we had to, as you know, because you gratefully sent me a copy, because I pre-ordered last year, and obviously the first print run or whatever sold out. So I got a message from OUP saying your book is essentially on back order, and that's when I emailed you to say I'm still super keen to have this discussion. I just don't have my hands on the book, and you kindly sent me one, right? So I got that, and I was racing to read that before the first time we were due to. For people listening, we had to do a brief reschedule of this recording, and I was frantically busy trying to get that book read, and I was racing up to do all various farm chores, heading up into the nearest town to get some travel vaccinations, and raced past the post office to pick up my usual like bundle of packages and things that I get sent. And I was just driving up. It was about a 25-minute drive, and I'm driving up to pick up the vaccines from the pharmacy and then go to the clinic to get stabbed. And I'm like, so I had this sort of half an hour, 40-minute gap in between these things. And I was kicking myself for not bringing the book, because I'm like, I'm just going to be sitting in a waiting room. So I pull up in the car park of the clinic, and I'm like, well, I do have a book with me. I don't know what it is yet. It's in a package in the back of the car. And I open it, and it's my OUP copy. So
great.
I was thinking the whole time, and I was about 2/3 of the way through the book, and I'm like, God, this is like an hour of downtime, and I'm recording with Diana tomorrow. What the hell is wrong with me? Why didn't I bring that book? And there, like, of literally all the books you could get, because with a job like this, I get sent a lot of books. There it was. The one book that showed up that day was yours, and it was in the car.
That's great.
And so I put down the copy you sent, and I picked up the one that I'd actually bought, and and I'm like, that's weird. Like, but it's one of those stories that's doesn't sound that impressive, except that I sat there in the car thinking, well, I need to read Diana's book. I don't have it. I might as well read whatever this book is. And then I open the package, and it's your
That's
book.
really
like,
funny.
That's weird. That's one of those like,
Yes.
okay. That's actually why I asked, like, have people been sharing syncs to do with the book once it came out? But seeing as we're chatting about this stuff, I really like this. What's the book encounter?
Okay, so the book encounter is so it's a synchronicity, a meaningful synchronicity, but the way I use the phrase book encounter, because every person who I interviewed in the book who was an experiencer had a book encounter. And that means that it was like what happened with me with Nietzsche, or what happened with you here. So once they had an experience that they couldn't really understand, a UFO experience, or, whatever they wanted to call it, they couldn't, it didn't fit into their framework, right? The kind of way in which they think of the world. They would then find a book. A book would pop out at them, or someone would give them the book, or Tyler had it. So Tyler was beginning to understand his work because he was recruited into the space program when he was fairly young, in his 20, I think he was 20. And so he said that after the Challenger episode where he lost his good friend, the astronaut Judy Resnick, he said that he was in a state of depression and he didn't know what to do, leave the space program, wasn't sure what to do. And he also was getting the information about non-human intelligence. And he said that somehow somebody had put in his luggage Cosmos by Carl Sagan. And so that was his book encounter. He said it completely changed his view of everything and got him on this kind of new track. So a book encounter is basically what Arthur Koestler called the library angel. And it's that book that shows up when you most need it. And I also interviewed Kary Mullis. Kary Mullis is a Nobelist in chemistry, won the Nobel Prize, I think it's in the 90s. And he talks about that his process of creativity, he discovered the polymerase chain reaction, which has revolutionized technology, basically. And he talks basically about a book encounter, right? That, sometimes it's what you don't think you need. You're not looking for it. And all of a sudden there it is. And it's precisely that which you need. And so, it's not just Koestler who talked about this. It's Carl Jung talked about it. So many scholars have talked about this kind of idea of synchronicity. And Jacques Vallée is doing it now. He's revisiting what the synchronicity is. And he's talking about it in terms of information science and map science, mapping. And so there are different ways of trying to understand what it is. And so I had to write about it in the book because every single person had experienced it and they told me about it in a meaning, like they said, this helped me. This was it. I had to do this. And so if I'm a researcher who has to use the data, even if I don't understand it. So I basically wrote about it. I don't have any conclusions about it, but I do know that it happened to every person. Some people had different experiences of it. Some people thought that it pointed them on the right road to what they needed to do in their actions. Some people, like David Stinnett, said, don't drink the Kool-Aid. He was like, it's pretty intense, but this is just how it is. This is how life is. And he actually sent me a quote by Carl Jung, which was, this was at the end of my book, so I couldn't, maybe I did put it in the book. I can't remember. But he basically said, if you pay attention and you're awake to life and the universe, the synchronicities don't stop. Like it's all, the universe talks back to you. And that's what life is about. And I actually have a friend, Sister Rose McNamara, and she basically has told me that too. She said, Diana, she goes, come on, why are you always so surprised by these things? This is the way it really is. The other way is the way that it's not, but people are just fooled into thinking it is.
Yeah, very true. Very true. I like the book encounter thing sort of captivated me because doing this show for I think you're episode 161 of a weekly show, right?
Wow.
For new guests or first time guests, I ask, are they weird kids? And so usually the first third or so is I did that to you last year. And usually for the first third or so, it's a biography or people telling the story of how they came to be the person who ends up on a podcast like this. And there's always a book encounter. So it's typically more to do with, it might be magic or animism, not necessarily. I have ufologists and whatever on the show, but it's structurally, we can broadly say that they were odd in the sense of having peculiar dream experiences or whatever as children. And then somewhere, or even a bit later, they have a strange experience or a psychedelic one, and then they'll have a book encounter. It'll be different. It'll be cosmic trigger. It'll be whatever. But there's always that moment of hitting sort of like, coalesced thought that does the same thing. And as you were kind of describing this notion of the book encounter in American Cosmic, I'm like, that is a structural similarity to the kind of stuff I hear from my guests.
Yes, it's really interesting. And, it doesn't have to be a book. It could be a movie encounter, or it could be some people have song encounters. It's that piece of information that you need in order to make what would you call it? Make a conclusion or come to some type of like, it's meaniful. That's the most I can say is it's clearly meaningful.
And it is some sort of part of some kind of process because, I mean, this is a good time to talk about it. You write that UFO experiences only become religious after the fact. Like, elaborate on that for us, because there's some, again, structural similarities here, or very often a thing like a book encounter is presumed to be involved in such a process. Yes.
Okay, so what I do, in a sense, so we have a person who you may know her work. Her name is Ann Taves.
Yes.
And she's in religious studies at UC Santa Barbara, and she does a lot of cognitive science of religion, and she's written a book called Religious Experience Reconsidered, where basically she looks at how religious experiences become quote unquote religious. So it's the same thing with the UFO experience, right? So we have an experience, and then what happens is that we then go through processes of interpretation that then coheres into a dominant interpretation. And a lot of the book encounter is helping us do that. And I think that that's really interesting because, okay, let's take different levels. And actually, if I do ever write about this, because I've thought about writing about the coincidence, meaningful coincidence, synchronicity, and kind of like, going through everybody who's written about it in the past and then kind of offering something new about it that I think is interesting. And part of that is that there are different levels of people's acceptance of this kind of encounter or this type of experience that they have. One is that it's the universe talking to them and showing them. It's like if they're religious, this was all over the Catholic communities that I studied when I was doing my book about purgatory. All of them had meaningful coincidences that they considered to be basically messages from God. And it's also in evangelical Christian communities. It's also in Islamic communities. And so that's why I call them the engine of religion, the engine of religious belief, these synchronicities or coincidences. And what Friedrich Nietzsche was trying to say was, that's the kind of way, no, he said, don't do it. Don't become religious. Don't dogmatize the synchronicity. And so David Stinnett probably never read Nietzsche, but came to the same conclusion, basically saying, don't do that because you don't know really what, it's like it'll shut your mind down if you do it and then you won't have them anymore. Basically, in order to experience them, you've got to be open to what's coming your way. You've got to be open to the things around you. And if you dogmatize it into a religion, God is talking to me, then most likely you'll shut that process down.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very interested in this kind of stuff. It's there's a high degree of overlap between what we're talking about here and my first book, and also some presentations I've given in London and that kind of stuff, because it's important that we don't say or don't over-describe this too much, but it's also important that we don't under-describe it, which is it's almost like a snowball effect of interpretation after subsequent events. And those events, if they're UFO experiences or synchronicities or whatever, do appear to be going way back in history, a thing that, or evidence of some sort of ongoing interaction with humans and whatever these collections of phenomena are, right? So it's important not to say too much about it, but it's also important to kind of table that, especially as there's an element of the absurd very often in like a slight majority of these initial experiences. And would you say that's baked in by design? I think I'm getting to like Dr. Vallet's sort of thermostat metaphor here, which is if we kind of take this wider view of these unusual encounters, be they synchronicities or whatever, and the subsequent human behavior that forms around them as we try to process them, it's very compelling to suggest that we are often moved is mankind being directed into thinking certain ways about certain things?
Yes. Okay. So this is a good question. the absurdity of it. So okay, so I guess I'm not. Can you?
So, like, if we're looking at it, the process you described, where we're talking about, say, UFO experiences only become religious after the fact, and the very good assumption that there are intelligences behind various UFO experiences, right? Sort of suggests that from the other side of Dr. Kreipel's one-way mirror, there is the risk or capacity to move or compel human beliefs in certain directions. And I'm wondering if that's the first thing, and I think that's in play. And I'm just sort of wondering if the absurdity that's often baked into it is by design to allow that to happen. It's almost like building a pearl, right? Like, it's an unusual experience that's an irritant, and because of its absurdity, it does have to kind of, we have to think with it and sit with it and process it for a long time, and it kind of creates it. But are we sort of squinting down at, and I don't want it to sound entirely malicious, but are we sort of squinting down at non-human, this is the trouble, the words are all malicious, like non-human manipulation of human culture when we do this?
Right. This is such a great question. Okay, so I have a lot of thoughts about it. And I would have to say that the ways in which I've been understanding, especially because I'm still involved with the work with James and Tyler in the book, and each of them have contributed, I mean, in incredible ways. And it is sad that their research is not public, but each of them suggests that, first, the way in which we understand time and the way in which our brain processes time is involved in this. So we have memories for the past, we have, our conscious, rational mind for the present, and then perhaps we have something for the future, as James' research suggests. And then with Tyler's work, we also have this strange story going on, like almost like a script. And he can't. So it reminds me, I don't know if you saw that episode of, by the way, I've been so busy in the last 20 years of my life that I'm not a TV watcher. But strangely, in the last month, probably because I'm done with this book, and it really took a lot out of me, I started to watch the episodes of Black Mirror, which my students have told me they needed to watch. And there's this great episode, I think it's called, I think it's a bad word in your part of the world. So I might not say it, but it's basically about multiverses and the future and synchronicities. And so this idea that the absurd is, I think you're right, is like, okay, so we are living, we don't have control. Like Tyler always says, why do I feel like I'm living in a script and I don't really have control over what I'm doing? But I'm, the things that happen to me, like, show me what I'm doing, but I only know it after I do it. You see? So it's almost as if there's some type of like a story going on. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the way we tell each other things, like you talk about, your guests talking about their biographies, and religions even being basically, these stories that we tell. I'm not saying it's not true.
Sure.
I'm just saying that they're narrative stories, right? There are these, that this is structurally inherent to being human. And so if there's what I might call like a higher level of being human, or a level of being human that we're not necessarily conscious of all the time, this is it, right? So a lot of philosophers have talked about that. There's another philosopher, I think, who is it? I think it was, Schopenhauer or Nietzsche, one or the other, who basically said, when, at the end of your life, you look back and you understand why it all happened. Like, why it had to happen this way. And Nietzsche has said that too. So you look back and it's kind of like that story had to happen that way, even though at the time I didn't understand it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, so in a sense, so in a sense, like, do synchronicities have to do with us, like kind of like a break in the story, you know? Like when in that episode of The Matrix, when I can't remember what she's called, the Oracle basically talks to Neo and he says, "You knew I was going to sit down, didn't you?" And she says, "Yes, she's a program in the Matrix, and he has no clue if he's a program or not." So it's kind of odd. Yeah. I want to tell you this too, because it goes along the same way with synchronicities. And I think I'm free to tell it because I actually organized a conference, even though I was not there. And I wasn't there because of the hurricane situation. But there was a conference, and Jacques Vallée was there to talk, and it was in California, and he was there to talk about his new theory about synchronicities and coincidences. And so he used Rizwan Virk's new book out called Why We Live in a Simulated Reality, or Why Religion Says We Live in It. I forgot the exact title of the book, but you should check it out. It's really interesting. And so he talked about that. And Rizwan is a MIT gaming guy. He's like a programmer, and a PhD. And so Jacques basically talked about synchronicities with respect to simulated realities and multiverses and things like that. And I wasn't there, unfortunately, but I heard all about it because I had co-organized the conference. And so, of course, a lot of the people I had invited like texted me afterwards and said, "Wow, listen to this synchronicity." So Jacques gives this great talk about his new theory, which, by the way, I hope he writes up and publishes. And so then what happens is that, we live in this simulated reality. And how do we know? We know because of information theory and synchronicities. And so everybody breaks for lunch. And as they go out and break for lunch, who do they happen to see but Lawrence Fishburne, who's like Morpheus.
I love it.
And Lawrence Fishburne looks at everybody and kind of smiles. So it was just a very strange thing for everybody at the conference.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's I like it.
Yeah.
You coming back to what Tyler said, I guess, about time and what how human perception of time, or even just reality, I suppose, is probably not up to the task of modeling, and that's why these experiences look like what they do. One of the things that you can, I hope, say a bit more about this in the book is he had, or has presumably, some very specific protocols for what for contacting what he considers off-world intelligences. Now, as a ritualist, I find that very interesting. That there are, is there anything, what do they entail as described to you? Stuff you can tell us, obviously. I don't know if that's stuff he doesn't want shared, but that's really interesting to me.
He absolutely will share it. Absolutely. He said, please talk about it all you want.
Oh, excellent.
So, yeah, I can talk about it. So basically he this is very fascinating. So he's not on social media, obviously. He doesn't watch television. He's not on technology a lot, except for what he has to do with his job. He spends hours and hours and hours outside in the sun. And he thinks that the way to connect, that our natural DNA receptor, we have a natural receptor, and that a lot of being indoors, a lot of caffeine, obviously drugs and alcohol are going to mess up that ability to catch the signal, is how he puts it. And so he also does yoga, which is kind of interesting. He does yoga, and this person is from the South and Southern Baptist and does yoga, but obviously not Southern Baptist anymore. You've read the book. And so, goes through a ritual pretty much every single day, gets an incredible amount of sleep, like says that nobody sleeps enough, which, by the way, sleep therapists are basically saying today, right? We just don't sleep enough. So he basically says your body is attuned to at a certain I think he calls it a certain megahertz, and that if you don't allow your body to have that, you will not be able to, be fully functioning as a human being. And he thinks that these kinds of things are natural for us to hook into, like indigenous populations, right? Hooking into these frequencies and understandings and things like that, and these downloads. And so he says so his protocol is basically living extremely in a healthy way and not being on the internet a lot or at all, really.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, just from a ritual perspective, that sort of matches a lot of stuff to do with fasting before particular operations and so on. But I found that. So, as far as I can understand, then it's his version of clean living and spending a lot of time outdoors, and then
with the sun. The sun is
exactly.
Really
important. And then the. And then the either inspiration for ideas or the communication then occurs in the imaginal, whatever that is, right? So those are literally the steps he does. I mean, he does a lot of yoga and so on to keep the kind of, receptor in tip-top shape, I suppose. But that's literally it. Like, he's not out there invoking, he's not out there calling on particular planetary intelligences or anything. It's just quietly listening in an optimal state.
Yes, it is. And I also want to say that since the book has been published, I've been in contact with various people from who've been in these programs, right? The programs that study UFOs, like Hal Puthoff and people like that. And there were also remote viewers. And now what I've come to understand is that I think what Tyler was probably doing was basically a program which he probably had no clue he was doing, of initiating remote viewing, basically, because remote viewers are in similar ways, they do these things. And so when Tyler described when he would get this idea that would come into his head and he'd later make a technology out of it, like a patent and then a technology, he would describe it as a physical sensation, like a physical thing. And so what's strange is that in talking with like Hal Puthoff, he would say, well, when the remote viewing research was going on, a lot of the training would have to do with kind of shutting off what is called the executive function, your rational mind. And basically, when you describe something, not describing like the target, not describing it in rational terms, but basically describing it, how does it make you feel? Like, what does it feel like?
It's exactly why I asked the question, because there are, like, as a ritualist, that's a structural similarity. And it was interesting that he kind of emerged. But there's kind of more to it if we're talking about the remote viewing stuff, right? Which is, Tyler describes a room at the Space Center that, in his own words, changes the frequencies of his body and thoughts. What do you think is going on there? Is that just a Faraday cage, or is there something else going on there?
What you mean when Tyler is able to do this thing?
I'm interested in that room
the room. Got it. So which room? Because there are two. There's the room where he feels as if nothing can get in and nothing can get out, but his thoughts have been changed.
Yeah, that
and
one.
Then there's
oh no, hang on.
Right.
Well,
then there's the other room. The other room is where he goes where nothing is impossible, right? Where they go into the.
I think it's the first one, the one that says that changes the frequencies of. He said that of his body, and I'm assuming that. I mean, unless there's something weirder, because speaking of the remote viewing program and other sort of various MK projects, Faraday cages improve quote unquote clairvoyance, right? So, like, is that room just a Faraday cage, or do you know if there's anything else that they got going on there? Because that's, from an official position an unusual thing to have at the Space Center. We know it's not, but it does necessarily imply that if they're allocating resource and budget and floor space, they're aware that these methods of deriving information have validity. So I'm interested in what you can say about that room.
Okay, so that room, he told me about that room. And it's a room where I guess it was in his early stages of coming to some type of realization, I guess at the same time that he was reading the book by Carl Sagan. And he was coming to a realization of basically the reality of off-planet intelligence. And, it wasn't easy for him either, right? So, think about it. And that room, he was stationed at a place where he was near that room. And he said it was a mystery about what was in the room because it was a big, giant concrete block of a room. And he said, I don't know, and I'm quoting from my book, I don't know what was in that room, but whatever it was either they didn't want anything to get in there or they didn't want anything to get out of there. But he felt that he had been changed after being in that facility. Mm. That's all I know about it. He wouldn't elaborate.
Okay, yeah. I find, again, I look at this stuff. There's a sort of theft component to it where I'm looking for structural similarities that I can use, and that's fascinating. I didn't realize it was it was a room that he not necessarily found, but was part of the sort of existing infrastructure. So my guess would be Faraday cage, maybe with something else. But staying with Tyler, and this kind of comes back to the same, or it's part of his job, as described in the book, is to be placed in certain locations and have, essentially his mere presence trigger anomalous events, presumably beneficial synchronicities. So what do you think is going on there? I mean, I don't mean describe things, don't give us examples that you can't tell us, but what do you think is going on there? How is that happening?
Right. So this is where so I know as much as I wrote in the book, and Tyler is a person who would never tell me something that was classified or anything like that. I mean, he's so. What do I think though? So that's where I have remember the categories I said I had my opinion and that kind of thing. And okay, so I could tell you what I believe here is that I think that within our usual framework of understanding the human body, we don't give it enough credit. And I think that people like Tyler have physical abilities that he has either been born with, naturally, or that he's somehow cultivated, and that those physical abilities, I mean, it's like the books on remote viewing, right? And so if you look at any of the people who've written about remote viewing, and Joe McMoneagle comes to mind because he's interesting. He basically says everybody's psychic, right? A lot of people can remote view, but only certain people are really, really good at it. He said, it's just like boxing, or it's just like a sport, basketball. Only some people are stars. And so Tyler's a star of some sort, who's able to make these connections and do these kinds of things. And so I think that I think that what happens is that, this is my opinion, I think that people like that, their careers, they've spent their whole career doing this, and they're looked at and they have an improbable record of success. Well, if it's an improbable record of success, that's the person you want to promote and use, right? And utilize. So that's what happens. So, it's not just luck. Whereas, Tyler a lot of times say, well, I just got lucky this, and I got lucky that. And I said, wait a minute, that's not luck. I don't know what's going on, but that is, it's just improbable. It's improbable. If it's improbable luck, it's not luck. Luck is just random.
No, agreed. Well, that's kind of it. I think where I was going with that was, has he turned himself into a lucky charm or a magical object, right? Because by virtue of having, I mean, I'm on board with his description that he is interacting with off-planet intelligences. Whatever. Like, that's completely fine with me. I actually think that's probably what's going on, at least in some, again, maybe at a fourth, fifth dimensional level, whatever you want to call it. It's not necessarily exactly that, but I'm completely fine with that as an idea. And he also spends all this time getting the body prepped to be able to do it. So do you think, having done that for enough time, he's kind of turned himself into a relic, a magical object, and so that conditions of reality change around him, which is just what you were talking about? That's sort of where I was going. Is that?
Oh, that's fascinating. I really like that. I hadn't thought, I talk about the relics in the book, and I do kind of make comparisons with religious relics, but I had never thought of actually Tyler as a relic. And that's brilliant. That's really, really good. So Tyler as a relic, yes, but he didn't turn himself into the relic. Somehow it happened to him. And so listen, think of how odd it was for him to have met me. And then me knowing about, just like you do, knowing about the history of religions and rituals, and saying to him, do you know you're doing like almost like a ascetic practice? He didn't even know what the word ascetic meant. He's like, what are you talking about? And I said, this is very similar to what monks and nuns and, the people from this, these people do this to actually connect with what they believe is the sacred. And that was news to him. So let's just say that this was never an intentional process for him. It somehow just happened. And
yeah, exactly.
Once it happened, though, I have to tell you that he also, just as I went through an epistemological shock, he did too. So he also became incredibly, let's see. So for the first few years of writing the book, I went through a process of just completely being, like, wow. My everything was just different for me. Like, I couldn't go back to the old existence. And he did too in meeting me. And it was only because I provided him with information that made sense to him. And he finally understood his life. He was like the Fight Club thing. Literally, he cried when he read it, because he said, no, he like his own family would laugh at him when he put on the robe and come down in the morning and have his coffee. Well, he doesn't have coffee, and go out and do his stuff. And they'd laugh at him. But somehow I knew that that's the character he was. Now, how did I know that? I never talked to him about it. So it was a surprise to me that he had the soap, that that this was his favorite character, and that he felt he was this character. And that, in fact, he read it. And when he read that chapter about himself, that was like, he couldn't believe that somebody could actually know that about him. So, I mean, think about how strange that was. So he's a relic for sure. There's no doubt about it. I can't go anywhere with him without people feeling that energy. Like, I discussed going with him to the Vatican. I mean, it almost makes me feel insecure.
Well, the Vatican was going to be like, do you think, I looked at, there's two things that were fascinating about him saying that to me. The first is, there is a model for it, which is the relic or saints or yogis, like holy men and women have that capacity of luck and changing conditions around them throughout history and today in places like India and wherever, right? That again comes back to, there is something sort of structural about this, right? So that's the first bit that fascinated me. And the second bit was that there is, again, awareness of this reality at a sufficient level for him to actually be deployed for those purposes, like just hang about here and just Tyler it up, right? And do you think it happened to him in the Vatican or at the Vatican in its own way, this kind of like lucky charm effect, given, I don't want to, we'll save the surprises for the listeners who haven't read it, but it's kind of lucky charm effect unlocked some doors for you, right?
Yes. So obviously he had this ability young, and then kind of, it just so happened that he then got promoted because of it and that type of thing. And I also talk about other people in the book in the military who also, who are told to use their sixth sense, and this and that, that kind of thing. So that does happen there. And the reason is because it works. They don't care. They're not going to make any kind of ontological argument for its ontological reality. They couldn't care less about its ontological reality. It's it works. So they're going to use it. Okay. So that's one thing. The second thing is that it's a good thing. My book was, by the way, finished and after the Ray Hernandez chapter. So the last chapter wasn't even in the book when I went. And then when I went to the Vatican, I realized that this had to be the last chapter because, well, first I did take Tyler because I thought he'd be useful. And in fact, I couldn't have access to a lot of the things I did have access to had he not been there because of his lucky charm presence, as you would call it.
Yeah, I find that really fascinating, the dual component of it. You're right. As Alex Sakira says, that sort of shut up and calculate model is definitely there when it comes to psi or the anomalous and the military and intelligence agencies. If it works, it's used, right? And I resonate very strongly with that, frankly. But it kind of comes back to, and you're absolutely the best person to ask for this, of course. If that's the case, and Tyler has, let's make the assumption, I think it's a good one, has developed systems or protocols to improve on some inherent capacities he was born with. I think that's fair, right?
Yes.
So what is technology? Is he a technology? Like, if we're talking about how these things, you're absolutely the right person to ask, but do we need to widen what technology is? Yes. Yeah. Yes,
we do. So that's really, that is, technology is in the title of the book. And I begin with, talking about technology and end with it too. So Tyler is a technology, and he actually believes that we are technology, and he even uses language that describes people technologically. When I wrote the book, I mean, this sounds pretty terrible, but I'm going to say it anyway. He said, he calls people, what kind of processor do they have? Do they have the processor that will understand this kind of thing? Will their processor be able to handle this level of information kind of thing? And so he'll say, he talks about it with respect to, there's like Microsoft 7.0 or, 4.0 or whatever, 7.6 or right. He talks about people like that too. So it sounds really bad, but I came across so many people who believed in extraterrestrial intelligence in Silicon Valley who basically describe people like that, they just have, a 1.0 processor. They're not going to understand that. I mean, they literally, that's the language that they use. So I think that there's a belief system that we are information, and that, some of us have more bandwidth, I guess you'd call it, and that there are different iterations. I mean, it all sounds so incredibly not politically correct. And that was hard for me too in the book to write about, because here I was dealing with, Silicon Valley. I mean, people in Silicon Valley, people who are creating these biotechnologies and making millions of dollars from them. And I had to go into those communities and really understand them and try to convey this without sounding kind of like eugenicist, I guess, and just be honest. And I tried to do that as much as possible and say, look, this sounds weird, but, and so that's where the saint, she's not a saint actually, but the Catholic nun Maria of Agreda came in. The Catholic Church used her narrative of astral travel basically to New Mexico. And I was thinking in the same way, they're using these people like Tyler, right? Not the Catholic Church, but the kind of like the military complex.
A power structure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. Well, I mean, it was a fascinating, or is a fascinating read. I mean, I've read it, so it's in the past tense, but for people who haven't, it's a really fascinating read. And again, because I'm kind of a bit of a nerd for stuff like the remote viewing thing, it was interesting to get what additional insights into. I have this theory. Let me re-describe it. That the most interesting school of magic that developed in the 20th century was in fact developed during the Cold War by intelligence agencies. So you kind of have a few to choose from in the West, right? You've sort of got your Wicca and neo-pagunism and so on.
You're right.
But the most interesting one, the most interesting 20th century form of magic was developed, during the Cold War. And so for me, just really fascinating stuff. Tyler's story there is another piece in that kind of school of magic.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it is exactly that. Yeah.
Nice one. Well, you said you weren't on social media, so this is the bit of the show where I say, Diana, for people who want to know more, where do they go? Book website, all that kind of stuff?
Sure. So the book is available on most places like Target or Barnes & Noble and Amazon and the Oxford University Press website. And I have a website called AmericanCosmic.com. I was on social media, but for various reasons, I'm not on that. But I will be on it about 6 months from now.
Cool. Nice one. All right. And of course, all these details will be in the show notes. And I love these chats. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
It's a really unique presentation of a obviously extremely fascinating topic. So, and I love talking to you about it. So thank you very much for your time, Diana.
Thank you, Gordon. It was wonderful to talk with you again.
Really fascinating stuff there. Regular listeners or, anyone who has read my first book, Starships, A Prehistory of the Spirits, will see why I spent so long exploring Tyler's methodology for improving what he considers to be contact with off-planet intelligences. And in many ways, even more interesting, I suppose, how these ongoing practices have turned him into someone who can be, placed in certain locations to kick off certain effects. And a religious studies professor is absolutely the right person to notice. That's more or less identical to the effects observed around holy men and women, yogis, stylites, stories from Acts of the Apostles and so on. For me, it's a deeply fascinating and compelling indication that, preaching to the choir here, I suppose, there is something structural to what we loosely call magic, and it's unavoidable, yet eternally indescribable relationship with what we call the stars. Anyway, that's this week's show. Be sure to check out Diana's previous episode, which is in the show notes. And of course, grab yourself a copy of American Cosmic if this sounds like your sort of thing. Subscribe to the show, visit the Facebook page or runesoup.com for much, much more. And as always, find me on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.